Hello students, welcome to ePathshala. I am Amitabh Dwivedi, Associate Professor of Public Administration in Devi College, Chandigarh. The idea of participation has gained a lot of popularity and importance in the recent times. This is primarily because it is put forth as legitimizing principle and also as mechanism for developmental discourse. So it becomes important for us to understand the idea of participation through its genesis, the institutional mechanism, the goals pursued, and socio-political issues embedded in order to unravel its importance in socio-political developmental discourse. In this module, we are going to study the theoretical roots of the idea of participation, and then we'll shift our concern to the issues of implementation of this idea. The term participation has its genesis in participare, meaning to participate and share in or partake of. It continues to mean the same even today as an act or instance of participating, taking part in and sharing, and the state of being related to a larger whole. The literal meanings say nothing about the nature of the collective action, the institutional mechanism that facilitates participation, goals being pursued, and the nature of power relation and the social structure it is embedded in. For these purposes, we need to turn the conceptual evolution of the idea of participation. Conceptually, the idea of participation draws from two distinct sets of theories. The first and the older one involves right and obligations of citizens to take part in and share in the administration of justice and the politics. The other and the more recent one is understood as a set of developmental approaches and methods. Today, the idea of participation draws from both set of theories of citizenship and development to be seen as the most socially just mechanism of organizing power relations in society. Therefore, its contemporary popularity emanates from the fact that it is increasingly being put forth as the legitimizing principle as well as institutional mechanism for developmental discourse. Therefore, it becomes extremely pertinent to engage with and understand the genesis, nature, institutional mechanism, goals pursued, and its socio-political embeddedness to unravel the rationality behind the participatory developmental politics. Theories of participation. Participation is inherent to all social collective efforts in nature of human and animals alike, and its role becomes even more important in case of settled life, involving elaborate institutional mechanism to organize participatory collective endeavors. It was with similar understanding that we see the rise of the idea of participation in communitarian republics epitomized by Greek city-states, involving active and obligatory everyday experience of being involved in the public affairs and collective interests of the community. However, this participatory ethic is lost with the rise of expensive kingdoms or is limited to local affairs and returns in a truncated, passive and representational form of electoral democracy. The active participatory ethic re-emerges even as citizenship discourse is lost in expanding the scope of rights it entails in the developmental discourse, attempting to embed itself in the everyday life and lived realities of the people. Therefore, this section looks at the evolution of the idea of participation as it emerged in classical works of Aristotle, its disappearance amidst rule of law regime of Roman citizenship. Then it looks at how sets of rights replaces participatory ethics in modern regimes, the contestation and the struggle for the scopes of rights amid states legitimized by their welfare role, and the rise of participatory developmental discourse. Herein, we look at the rise of technocratic participatory model, its critique for being tyrannical in terms of unjust exercise of power, and the transformatory potential it has if seen right-based developmental agenda with democratic practice. Participation as citizens' right. The idea of participation in the management of the public affairs has its roots in classical Greek political theories of citizenship. Herein, the likes of Aristotle saw citizenship as the sharing of the administration of justice and in holding of public office. In this light, participation involved everyday experience of taking part in the political affairs of the collective. This implied sharing responsibilities in legislating and executing rules as well as obeying them. In this context, active participatory citizenship dominated every realm of social life, with community being seen as prior to and the constitutive of individuals whose life, living conditions, and identity were offered and defined by it. This laudable conception of participation in the management of public affairs did, however, suffer from lacuna of exclusion of women and slaves from its fold. In spite of this lacuna, it did allow the participant citizens or members of a political community to take part in the collective act of managing the political affairs of his or her community. With the expansion of political communities in terms of territorial and population size, the practice of inclusion of new members led to the loss of participatory ethic, as political membership involved personal safeguards through rule of law. It re-emerges with the self-governing republican regime of Italian city-states, the autonomous civil and political authority regulating public affairs of an independent community. Rooted in the theory of social contract, herein participation implied the historical delegation of rights to self-preservation by the citizens to the government. The emergent right-based theory of citizenship sought to balance concerns with public order and the protection of life, liberty, and property intrinsic to the fulfillment of self-interest. This led to liberal democratic polities championing the cause of state sovereignty, economic liberties, and democratic equality to enable redistribution of resources through the invisible hand of free market. However, as Marx convincingly argued, the economic liberties and political equality of modern capitalist democracies was an illusion with an inherent deficit between the structural inequalities of class in capitalist system and the enjoyment of political equality in democracy. Therefore, the lack of scope for direct and active participation in the political affairs was the lacuna of liberal right-based citizenship. At the same time, in the post-colonial Third World, democratic equality needed conditions facilitating state institutions to become positive instrument for realization of ever-expanding rights of citizenship. Thus, within this regime, membership of a nation state or nationality became the source of all rights as well as the target of claim for expansion of their scope. The resultant expansion has been seen both as the result of concession decided upon and promulgated by the state as well as the result of popular participation in social struggles and movement. The actual process actually involved a series of political bargains and negotiations whereby elites seek to maintain their power through managing the effects of social change and containing the demands of social movements through concessions in form of rights. However, the technocratic mode of welfare and developmental planning and the populist agendas of socio-economic rights could not pave the way for reintroduction of the ethic of participation in political affairs. It was not until the closing decades of the 20th century that participation re-emerged as political concern, riding the wave of resurgent civil society, celebratory revival of civic mechanism by proponents of social capital, and rise of neoliberalism amidst piling evidence of state failure. It is against this background that the idea of participation in the political affairs is increasingly contested in terms of the level at which it is fostered and its scope in terms of the realm in which it is fostered in. Furthermore, the institutional mechanism that best support it and the social goals that can be pursued by them prove to be the other ground for the contestation and negotiation over the idea of participation. At the same time, as the extent and content of political community of the nation state itself is being challenged by sub and supranational communities imaginable in an increasingly globalized world, the issue of participation has been further contested in terms of multiple levels at which it is involved in collective decision making and collective action. It was with such concern the participation rise as a set of approaches to method for fostering inclusive development. Participation as a developmental approach. Initial forays into participatory development approach appeal for enabling poor to analyze their own reality to enable them to be at the heart of each development intervention. However, it was the works of Robert Chambers on participatory rural appraisal framework that led to the emergence of a family of approaches and methods to enable rural people to share, enhance and analyze their knowledge of their life and condition to plan and act. As a technocratic and modular developmental approach, it soon became a prominent feature in the public policies directed towards natural resource management, agriculture, poverty reduction and social welfare programs related to health and food security. The approach was legitimized in the name of people's centrality in developmental planning and practice through greater involvement of the local that facilitates accountability, relevance and empowerment through developmental governance. This dominant technocratic understanding of participation was challenged first by Uma Kothari and Bill Cook and their contributors in the edited volume Participation, the New Tyranny. For Cook and Kothari, these critiques focused on the technique of implementation of these participatory approaches without questioning the effect qualitatively or quantitatively of the approach. This modular participatory approach has been challenged over issues like obsession with local while ignoring wider structures of injustice, lack of understanding of how power relations at work as well as the role of structures and agencies in social change, and focus on technical rather than political methodology for empowerment. The first challenge is over the obsession of the participatory approach with the local as site, space as well as level of developmental intervention. The local is not a bound entity as understood by the modular approach, but it is constructed from overlapping and intersecting flows of dynamic social relations. It has its own hierarchies and is also part of several other hierarchies. The obsession with personal and local as sites of empowerment ignore the state and developmental community, the actual sites of power and knowledge, thereby ignoring the existence of power relation and structural injustices. The local is embedded in it. The fruits of democratic decentralized too are limited in poor rural areas with limited political agency and access to information and with bureaucratic hierarchy and control. Therefore, democratic decentralization did improve participation, but its impact on inequality and poverty remains modest due to inherent qualities, hierarchies, and power differential in social relations that excludes those without it. Moreover, the approach displays inadequate understanding of the role of structures and agency in social change as changing and multiple identities of individuals impact their choice about whether and how to participate. The success of participatory approaches dependent on several factors like poverty, literacy, wealth, education and information lies in securing the rights of the poor people. It is this pursuit, it does open up space for marginalized to negotiate with power in. Focus on technical rather than political methodology for empowerment further reveals the limitation of such approaches whereby development's grassroots organizations are converted into human software for investments with the least local opposition. The success of these approaches was rooted in the understanding of and responses to the need of the local community built on a close personal relationship. At the same time, individual thoughts, feelings and behaviors are influenced by group dynamics, especially the presence of real or constructed other in face-to-face interactions. In this light, participatory process can lead to risky collective decision, second-guessed decisions, decisions harmful to others. Scholars have also argued that for decentralization reform to be transformatory, they not only need the support but also promotion from political parties. Despite these political and theoretical challenges, believer of its transformatory potential came together for Giles Mohn and Sam Hickey's edited volume Participation from Tyranny to Transformation. Herein they argue that in order to be transformatory, participation has to be ideologically explicit with a coherent developmental theory encompassing multi-scale strategies applied at the institutional as well as structural level, linking participation to a right-based agenda that targets the developmental policies, social relation, institutional practices and capacity gap that cause social exclusion. Across these two theories to participation, the idea has varied from involving direct everyday participation in the making and implementation of laws to a distant historical participation in the social contract and regular participation in representative democracy. It has also implied the dominance and tyrannical reign as modular approach to development through the local critique for its ignorance of the power relation and injustice of inequalities and inadequate and technical understanding of what is necessarily a political process of empowerment. Issues of participation in Indian policy implementation. Even though India has its share of historical experience of participatory political communities like the ancient village republic, the idea of participation of citizens in the political affairs of a territorial state is of more recent origin. Furthermore, regulation of social behavior of the population of the entire expanse of what we know today as India through a centralized rule of law also does not have much historical precedence in this 5,000 years old civilization. It was only with the arrival of the British colonial masters that a system of rule of law was made applicable to most of India. The post-colonial national state that emerged was the first attempt of a so-called social contract that led to a set of fundamental rights with universal franchise-based polity. However, the post-independence Indian state was conceived as planning authority to construct a political ideological program that would facilitate the largest possible nationalist alliance involving elite leadership-based mobilization of the subaltern group to build modern India of modern Indians. Such assimilationist ideology of the Indian state had to do with the distinct historical processes leading to the rise of modern nation state in India. Unlike most, democratic governance through liberal institutions was not an outcome of class conflicts and struggle in India as popular democracy even before the rise of liberal institutions of an autonomous nation state by the colonial masters. Therefore, it continued with the colonial rationality of government's obligation to ensure the welfare of its population irrespective of their participation in the sovereignty of the state. As a result, the technocratic welfare model of governance through the detailed knowledge of conditions of social reality too predates the rise of modern state. The resulting state formation and mode of governance was technocratic but highly contested political issue as well as involving political struggles whose dynamics were shaped by the politics over development policies. This section of the module looks at how the issue of participation has evolved from such dichotomous genesis. In doing so, the paper first looks at the Nehruvian model of participation of local elite in what was described as the Congress system. The next section looks at the populist turn in the Indian policy implementation under Mrs. Gandhi. The third section begins by look at the causes put forth behind the crisis and the move towards a decentralized participatory mode of governance ushered in the closing decade of the 20th century. The Nehruvian model of nation building and participation. As the time of transfer of power came around, the negotiation over structure of the state, form of society and allocation of resources led to the polarization within Constituent Assembly as is reflected in the tussle between Nehru and Patel. It was over the strategy of social transformation between the socialist and the bourgeois function within Congress. However, the untimely death of Patel in 1950 ended the struggle without being settled and paved the way for the adoption of the Nehruvian model. Thus emerging Nehruvian model enjoying the subtle support and cultural approval of thinly but crucially dispersed of modern Indian elite sought India's social transformation through a passive revolution instead of mass mobilization and political negotiations. The goals pursued by the Nehruvian model spoke of freeing India through a new constitution, feeding and clothing its starving and naked masses and to give every Indian the fullest opportunity to develop himself according to his capacity. The idea of the state as the provider, protector and promoter of people was reinforced by the pursuit of adequate means of livelihood for all citizens to minimize inequalities of income, status and opportunities through health, education and social justice for the backward classes. And yet the rational embodiment of the state as a planning authority did not reduce the state's importance as the site for free citizens to engage in political negotiation and struggles. Therefore, the commodity-centered approach of technocratic planning process for accumulation had to contend with the democratic processes of the representative government. Thus, within the Nehruvian model, accumulation through technocratic planning was legitimized through representative government, implying avoiding the unnecessary rigors of industrial transformation by being a positive means of conflict resolution. The death of Nehru and the subsequent decline of the Congress system marks a distinctive turn in the Indian historiography. Political observers on their part have argued that the roots of the turn lay in the limitedness and ambiguity of Nehruvian reforms attempting to legitimize violent primitive accumulation within democratic framework. This transformed the institution of rational planning by being increasingly constrained, moduled and distorted by politics in the name of producing consent. The populist turn and expanding democratic participation. The Nehruvian model failed because the bureaucracy entrusted with the revolutionary task of social transformation was unsuited for the job and incapable of undertaking political negotiations involved. At the same time, the excessive bureaucratization of social life in the absence of structure of civil society created conditions for technocratic understanding of poverty to be solved by bureaucrats and experts. At the same time, political participation through an increasingly institutionalizing electoral democracy allowed the previously marginalized group to mobilize in the name of their differentiated needs of development. Amidst growing crisis of the electoral democracy, the state response was highly populist rhetoric of socialist transformations through direct appeal for popular support that deinstitutionalized the existing governance mechanism of the Congress system. Growth and equality became the rhetoric to justify as well as contest policies that shifted from community development schemes amidst targeted area groups' approach for poverty reduction. The expansion of categories entitled to subsidies made technocratic planning central to populist democracy and its vote bank politics. Organized particular interests based on class and identity were to be recognized and incorporated in planning strategy by prioritizing beneficiaries and relative allocation in redistribution. This emerged. The unified framework was imposed by the state to incorporate all political mobilizations. Social mobilizations with territorial solidarities were incorporated through the idea of federalism, while those with identity-based mobilization were incorporated through the ideology of protective discrimination. The resultant social conflict induced the state to transform citizens as object of three projects: development, security and secularism, subsumed within a centralizing, homogenizing and secularizing development discourse that saw all conflict to be rooted in unbalanced development. By transforming conflicts into law and order problems, the discourse perpetuates horizontal, that is between communities, and vertical, between state and society, violence leading to a crisis of institutions. The liberal democratic explanations for the Indian state's dismal economic performance argued that democracy brings political and economic life too close together for rational calculation in developmental decisions. While civil and political rights of its citizens were sanctified by the Constitution, but their development, both redistribution and growth, was to be achieved through economic planning. However, the eroded autonomy of the state slowed the rate of institutional change and government's capacity to raise rural resources for industrializations. Furthermore, the deepening of democratic institutions gave citizens a growing sense of empowerment, enfranchisement, and entitlement that reflected in their growing participation in diverse modes of politics across the spectrum of institutional electoral politics and radical protest-based alternatives. These protest actions and movements serve as source and means of legitimizing state authority through reflexive planning that build new institutions to address local demand and thereby broadening its social base. Thus, the political constituency of poor led to a new demand politics in India, wherein interest groups could force governmental agencies through ascriptive group mobilization facilitated by the politics of scarcity. In the process, Indian democracy acquired a distinct form of focusing on political equality of group rather than individual, assertion of electoral power of rural masses due to the specific sequence of economic modernization, conflict of secular state principle subjected to a democratic electoral ratification. The rise of participatory developmental approach in India. The rise of participatory developmental approach is intrinsically linked to the process of liberalization, decentralization and privatization introduced towards the end of the 20th century. While the economic side of this process had started with the end of the License Raj in India, its political side emerged with the constitutional promulgation of the Panchayati Raj institution. Championing the cause of growth with the social justice, herein development becomes the central issue of political mobilization and contestation. In this light, use of state's political power to introduce change for the weaker sections was seen as legitimate developmental politics. The state continues to be seen as exclusive social instrument capable of declaring universal obligations, implementing and adjudicating them, and enforcing redressal or accountability. Further, patterns of state authority, organization of state politics, and use of state power decisively influence the economic context and are key determinants of regional developmental dynamics. The attention, however, has now shifted on to mechanism of local governance, role and efficacy of social capital, and market mechanisms and better tools to assess human development. In addition to the formal institutions of local governance, that is PRI, new institutional forms loosely. Against this backdrop, the contemporary modes of governance in India are dominated by concerns of coverage, efficiency and reach of governmental intervention, their political differentiation on grounds of redistribution, recognition and representation, and democratic institutional anchor to embed these practices. The political contestation over each of these issues creates challenges and resistance to the concerns across spaces of collective decision-making and action over issues of social justice. Thus, since the last decades of the 20th century, the rise of participatory development through capability approach has seen excessive hype and hope being placed on relative young PRIs. These PRIs have become the primary mechanism of deciding upon the choice of beneficiaries and the specifics of various governmental projects. The civil society, though seen as the expansion of participation in terms of citizenship rights and democracy, has not been sufficiently interrogated for its developmental role. At the same time, political differentiated identity-based development has been the heart of most political mobilization on grounds of social justice and in terms of coverage, efficiency and reach of governance initiatives. The government on its part has focused on growth with equality and aims to enhance capabilities through provisions for education, health and livelihood. To conclude, we can say that the initial form of conception of the idea of participation was through electoral representation, through universal adult franchise. As far as the issue of participation in socio-economic development was concerned, it was followed through a technocratic method involving a non-participative method. However, this could not sustain for a long, and mobilizations paved way for populist approach. However, this populist approach could not redress the mass mobilizations against the Congress system, resulting in a massive institutional crisis in 1990s. The issue was tried to be addressed through the institution of Panchayati Raj. However, there is a need to analyze the impact of these institutions on the participation in order to make it more effective, so that it tries to achieve its true objective of transformation and empowerment of the poor and the marginalized. Thank you.